It was the autumn of 2001. America was still reeling. The wounds from September 11th were fresh, raw, and bleeding. The nation had barely begun to process the horror of watching the Twin Towers collapse, of seeing the Pentagon burning, of learning about the brave passengers of Flight 93 who fought back over the fields of Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people had died in a single morning. The country was afraid. The country was angry. The country was looking over its shoulder, waiting for the next attack. They didn't have to wait long, but this time, the attack wouldn't come from the sky. It would come through something far more mundane, far more trusted, far more intimate. It would come through the mail. What you're about to hear is the story of one of the most complex criminal investigations in American history. It's a story of invisible death, of nationwide panic, of a manhunt that would span 7 years and cost over $100 million. This is the story of the Anthrax Letters. And by the end, you'll understand why some questions remain unanswered to this day. The call came on October 2nd, 2001. A 63-year-old man named Robert Stevens had been rushed to JFK Medical Center in Atlantis, Florida. His symptoms were severe and baffling. High fever, confusion, vomiting. By the time he reached the hospital, he was already disoriented, struggling to speak, his body racked with something the doctors couldn't immediately identify. Robert Stevens was not a politician. He was not a military target. He was a photo editor at a tabloid newspaper called The Sun, published by American Media, Incorporated, the same company that produced the National Enquirer. He was a British immigrant who had lived in Florida for years. By all accounts, he was a kind man, beloved by his colleagues, a person who had no enemies. The doctors ran tests. What they found made no sense. In his spinal fluid, they discovered something that hadn't been seen in the United States in a quarter of a century: Bacillus anthracis, anthrax. For those unfamiliar, anthrax is caused by a spore-forming bacterium that occurs naturally in soil. It primarily affects livestock. Human cases are rare. When they do occur, they usually manifest in one of 3 forms. Cutaneous anthrax affects the skin. It's the most common form and the most survivable. Gastrointestinal anthrax occurs when someone consumes contaminated meat. It's more dangerous but still relatively rare. And then there's inhalation anthrax. This is the rarest form. It's also the deadliest. When anthrax spores are inhaled into the lungs, they can lie dormant for days before suddenly germinating. When they do, they release toxins that ravage the body. The mortality rate, even with treatment, is devastating. Robert Stevens had inhalation anthrax. At first, officials scrambled to explain it away. Tommy Thompson, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, suggested that Stevens might have contracted the disease by drinking from a stream while hiking in North Carolina. It was a reassuring explanation. It was also wrong. On October 5th, 2001, Robert Stevens died. He was the first person to die of inhalation anthrax in the United States in 25 years. And within days, investigators would discover that his death was no accident. The FBI and the Centers for Disease Control descended on American Media, Incorporated. Investigators in hazmat suits swept through the building, taking samples from every surface: desks, keyboards, doorknobs, mail bins. Anthrax spores were everywhere. But the critical discovery came when investigators turned their attention to the mail room. There, they found traces of anthrax on letters. Not random contamination, but concentrated deposits that suggested the spores had been deliberately placed inside envelopes. Someone had mailed anthrax to American Media, Incorporated. Someone had done this on purpose. As this revelation sank in, more reports began trickling in from across the country. In New York City, an assistant to NBC News anchor Tom Brokaw developed a strange skin lesion. It was dark, ugly, and unlike anything her doctors had seen before. cutaneous anthrax. Tests on mail delivered to NBC's offices at Rockefeller Center confirmed the presence of anthrax spores. Then came reports from ABC News. Another assistant, another infection, CBS News. The same story, the New York Post, an employee with cutaneous anthrax. Within days, a pattern emerged that chilled investigators to the bone. Someone was mailing anthrax to media organizations across America, and they weren't finished. The letters themselves were eventually recovered and analyzed. The envelopes were plain, business-sized, with handwritten addresses. The handwriting was blocky, almost childlike, as if the sender was deliberately disguising their natural style. The postmarks showed the letters had been mailed from Trenton, New Jersey. Inside the envelopes was a fine powder, and inside that powder were billions upon billions of anthrax spores. The letters sent to the media outlets contained the following message: 9/11/01. This is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. The message seemed designed to suggest Islamic terrorism. The references to Allah, to Israel, to death to America, all of it pointed toward the same forces that had attacked New York and Washington just weeks earlier. But investigators noticed something else. The spelling was off. Penicillin instead of penicillin. Was this a genuine error by a non-native English speaker? Or was it deliberate misdirection by someone pretending to be a foreign terrorist? Then came the second wave. On October 9, 2001, exactly 3 weeks after the first letters were mailed, another set of envelopes was dropped into a mailbox in Princeton, New Jersey. These letters were not addressed to journalists. They were addressed to 2 United States senators. Senator Tom Daschle of South Dakota was the Senate Majority Leader, one of the most powerful Democrats in the country. Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, another senior Democrat with enormous influence. Both men received letters containing anthrax. The letter to Senator Daschle was opened on October 15th by an aide in his Hart Senate office building suite. The moment the envelope was torn open, a puff of fine white powder escaped into the air. The Hart building was evacuated. When tests came back positive for anthrax, the implications were staggering. Someone had successfully delivered a biological weapon to the United States Senate. The letter to Senator Daschle contained a slightly different message. 9/11/01. You cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid? Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. The tone was more threatening, more personal. You die now. Are you afraid? But here was a critical detail. The anthrax in the Senate letters was different from the anthrax in the media letters. It was more refined, more deadly. The powder was finer, more easily dispersed into the air. While the media letters had contained a brown, granular substance, the Senate letters contained a powder that was almost white, almost weightless. Whoever had prepared this second batch had improved their technique. They were learning. What happened next revealed the horrifying reality of biological weapons. They don't respect boundaries. The anthrax spores didn't stay contained in the offices where the letters were opened. They spread through the postal system itself. Thomas Morris, Jr., was 55 years old. He had worked for the United States Postal Service for nearly 3 decades. He was a clerk at the Brentwood Postal Facility in Washington, D.C., the massive processing center that handled mail for Congress. On October 16th, Morris began feeling ill. He called a nurse hotline and described his symptoms: fever, cough, chest tightness. He mentioned that he worked at Brentwood. He mentioned that he knew about the anthrax letters. He was worried. He was told it was probably the flu. 5 days later, Thomas Morris, Jr., was dead. Joseph Kerseen, Jr., was 47 years old. He was also a postal worker at Brentwood. On October 21st, he went to the hospital feeling sick. He was misdiagnosed with the flu and sent home. The next day, Joseph Kerseen, Jr., collapsed and died. Investigators discovered that the letters to the senators had passed through high-speed mail sorting machines at Brentwood. Those machines had squeezed the envelopes, forcing spores out through the paper fibers. Thomas Morris and Joseph Kersine had never touched the letters. They had simply been breathing air that contained invisible death. The tragedy didn't end at Brentwood. On October 31st, a 61-year-old hospital worker in New York City named Kathy Nguyen died of inhalation anthrax. She worked in the supply room of the Manhattan Eye, Ear, and Throat Hospital. She had no obvious connection to any of the letters. To this day, the exact source of Kathy Nguyen's exposure has never been definitively determined. The leading theory is cross-contaminated mail. And then there was Ottilie Lundgren. Ottilie Lundgren was 94 years old. She lived alone in Oxford, Connecticut. She had no connection to the media, to politics, to Washington. On November 21st, 2001, Ottilie Lundgren died of inhalation anthrax. Investigators determined that mail sorting facilities in Connecticut had processed letters contaminated at other facilities. Some of those spores had made their way onto mail delivered to her home. She was 94 years old. She died because she opened her mail. By late October 2001, the United States was in the grip of a second wave of terror. People were afraid to open their mail. Sales of rubber gloves spiked. People began ironing their mail, believing heat might kill any spores. The attacks had achieved something that even September 11th hadn't fully accomplished. They had invaded the home. Hoax letters flooded the system. People mailed white powder as sick jokes or to create chaos. Each hoax required a full emergency response. Resources were stretched thin. Traces of real anthrax were found at the Supreme Court, at the State Department, in postal facilities across the eastern seaboard. And through it all, one question loomed larger than any other. Who was sending these letters? The FBI launched what would become the largest and most complex criminal investigation in its history. They called it Anthrax. At its peak, the investigation involved more than 100 FBI agents. They conducted more than 10,000 interviews. They collected more than 6,000 samples for testing. From the beginning, investigators were divided about the perpetrator's identity. The letters seemed to suggest an Islamic terrorist connection, but scientists who analyzed the anthrax spores found something astonishing. The material was sophisticated. It was the Ames strain, a particular type of anthrax used in American biodefense research for decades. The Ames strain was not something a foreign terrorist could easily obtain. It was held at only a handful of laboratories in the United States. This led investigators to a chilling hypothesis. The anthrax letters hadn't been sent by a foreign enemy. They had been sent by someone with access to America's own biodefense program. The killer was one of us. In the summer of 2002, the investigation took a dramatic turn. The FBI began focusing on a scientist named Stephen Hatfill. Hatfill was a former researcher at the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRID, located at Fort Detrick, Maryland. This was the primary facility for America's biodefense research. On August 6, 2002, Attorney General John Ashcroft publicly named Stephen Hatfill as a person of interest in the anthrax investigation. Hatfill's life was turned upside down. FBI agents followed him constantly. Television cameras camped outside his home. He lost his job. He lost his reputation. But investigators couldn't find any actual evidence tying Stephen Hatfill to the attacks. No witnesses placed him in New Jersey when the letters were mailed. No forensic evidence connected him to the envelopes. Year after year, the case against Hatfill went nowhere. In 2008, the Department of Justice agreed to a settlement. Stephen Hatfill received $5.82 million in compensation. He was innocent. The FBI had spent years pursuing the wrong man, while the real killer remained free. By 2007, the investigation had quietly shifted direction. Using new genetic analysis techniques, investigators traced the anthrax to a specific flask at USAMR ID designated RMR 1029. It contained the exact genetic match to the anthrax in the letters. The flask was maintained by a senior researcher named Bruce Edwards Ivins. Bruce Ivins had worked at USAMR ID for over 20 years. He was considered one of the leading experts on anthrax in the United States. On the surface, he seemed like an unlikely villain, a churchgoer who played keyboard in a Celtic music group and juggled at parties. But beneath the surface, Bruce Ivins was a deeply troubled man. Investigators discovered he had struggled with mental health issues for most of his adult life. He had been in and out of therapy for years. Most unusually, he had a decades-long obsession with a college sorority called Kappa Kappa Gamma, dating back to a romantic rejection. He had broken into sorority offices and stolen documents. This detail became crucial when investigators examined where the anthrax letters had been mailed. The letters had been dropped into a mailbox on Nassau Street in Princeton, New Jersey. Just a few hundred feet from that mailbox was an office of Kappa Kappa Gamma. Was this a coincidence? Investigators compiled their evidence. Ivins had direct access to the flask. He had the technical skills to prepare the spores. Laboratory logs showed he had worked unusually long hours late at night in the weeks before each wave of letters was mailed. He had inserted himself into the investigation, offering theories and pointing attention toward others. As the investigation intensified in 2008, Ivins became increasingly unstable. He made alarming statements in group therapy about violence and revenge. His therapist sought a restraining order against him. On July 27, 2008, Ivins was released from a hospital where he had been held for psychiatric evaluation. 2 days later, Bruce Ivins was found unconscious in his home. He had overdosed on acetaminophen. He died the following day. Bruce Ivins never faced trial. He never had the opportunity to defend himself. The case would never see a courtroom. On February 19, 2010, the Department of Justice formally closed the Anthrax investigation. They presented their case against Bruce Ivins. The forensic evidence, the unusual laboratory hours, his mental health issues, his obsession with Kappa Kappa Gamma. According to the FBI, Bruce Ivins had carried out the anthrax attacks alone, but not everyone was convinced. In 2011, the National Academy of Sciences released an independent review. While the genetic analysis was consistent with the theory that the spores came from Ivins' flask, they noted the science alone did not prove Ivins was the killer. Other researchers could have had access to samples from the same flask. Some experts questioned whether Ivins could have produced such sophisticated material alone. Others noted that investigators never found definitive proof Ivins had traveled to Princeton on the relevant dates. No toll records, no gas station receipts, no eyewitnesses. The circumstantial case was strong, but was it strong enough? These questions may never be definitively answered. Bruce Ivins is dead. Whatever secrets he held went with him to the grave. The Anthrax letter attacks of 2001 left a legacy that extends far beyond the immediate victims. 5 people died. Their names deserve to be remembered. Robert Stevens, the photo editor who loved his work. Thomas Morris, Jr., the postal worker who called for help and didn't receive it. Joseph Kersine, Jr., the dedicated employee who was misdiagnosed and sent home. Kathy Nguyen, the hospital worker who encountered death through no fault of her own. Ottilie Lundgren, the elderly woman who simply opened her mail. 17 others were infected and survived, but many suffered lasting health consequences. The attacks transformed America's approach to bioterrorism. Billions of dollars were invested in biodefense research. New detection systems were deployed. The threat of biological weapons became terrifyingly real. The case also raised profound questions about security within America's own research institutions. If the anthrax came from inside USAMID, it meant one of the nation's most secure laboratories had been breached by a trusted insider. The autumn of 2001 was a season of fear. America had been attacked twice, once from the skies, once through the mail. The nation was forced to confront a new reality, that terror could take many forms and that safety was never guaranteed. Robert Stevens went to work one day and never came home. Thomas Morris called for help, but help came too late. Joseph Kersine trusted the doctors who told him he had the flu. Kathy Nguyen never knew what had killed her. Ottilie Lundgren simply opened her mail. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives until an extraordinary evil reached out and touched them. The Anthrax Letters case is officially closed, but the questions it raised about security, about trust, about the nature of threat remain as relevant today as they were 2 decades ago. Whether you believe Bruce Evans acted alone, whether you believe the FBI got the right man, whether you believe the case was truly solved, these are questions you must answer for yourself. What is certain is this: 5 people died, and the mail was never quite the same again.